Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased that you are interested in pursuing this with me. One of the things that comes up in interreligious dialogue, interfaith dialogue, is the question in different religions of what it means to be human. And I've been interested in this question for decades now, but one of the things that's become obvious in the last 20 years to me is that we're in the middle of a shift in our understanding of what it means to be human. I teach a graduate level seminar, a PhD seminar, in what it means to be human in different cultures. And as we begin to develop that seminar to what it means to be human in the modern world, begin to look at are the ways we think about being human in the modern world changing now? And with the advent then of AI, one of the questions is, well, what does this mean for what it means to be human? And in particular, then, what is a kind of a Christian response? What does it mean in Christian ministry to have AI and our understanding of what it means to be human? So these are questions that I was very interested in. On the computer side, I want to say I do come by this honestly. I started as an astronomy major at the University of Texas. I did 2 summers internship where what I did was computer programming in Fortran to do analysis of satellite data. And I was an extremely early adapter to computers. I owned a TI 99 4A. I owned one of the very first IBM PCs that came out. I networked both of our seminaries uh, with Ethernet. I had one of the first 40 email addresses in Singapore. I installed Apache web server, by the way, native on a Macintosh. So I've always kept a finger in this, although I've got to say that after the 1990s, beyond the Pentium processor, computers got so fast and so complicated that a layperson couldn't keep up anymore, to be honest. And magazines like Byte magazine that dealt with this stuff, they went out of business. There was no, it became a specialized thing. Um, but I did watch attentively as there were discussions of expert learning systems in AI, and then was not terribly surprised to see this advent suddenly of AI take us in some senses by surprise with the Chat GPT becoming released to the public. And really in the academic world, within the last 2 years, turning things upside down. And to a certain extent, this is true in the religious world as well. A Chat GPT 4.0 can write as good a sermon as most of my students will ever write. It can do your research and research papers for you. And so we need, what does that mean? What does it mean when I'm spending my day chatting with Chat GPT to get questions answered? Right? How does that make me think about myself? And so I want to talk about all that. But I think to get into the meaning of AI for us today and our understanding of what it means to be human, that we do need to go back a little bit. And uh, to get to place us here, so I want to do a little bit of history. And I'm going to pause a bit and say, chat, put a Q&A here so that it's not just me talking, but I'll let you know when we're going to pause and have a listen for questions. If you've got a question, just go ahead and write it into the Q&A. I may not look at it right away, though. I'll wait till we take a little pause and I'll look over and see how I can respond to them. Some questions I may wait and to try to get them to the end, but I promise I'll try to get to every question before we close out tonight. So let's imagine ourselves back 500 years ago or so, 600 years ago. And someone comes up to us. I'm a worker living in a city, or I'm a farmer out on a farm in Europe. And we're going to confine ourselves to Europe, by the way, and European civilization for the moment. And someone comes up to me and says, well, what does it mean to be a human? Well, I've got a pretty ready image for that. And it comes from the church. I have been made in the image of God. That's the story in the book of Genesis. And what it means to be human is I'm made in the image of God, which is unlike all of the other creatures that God made. I mean, I live in a world that has bats and bears and lions and tigers and all kinds of stuff like that. but they're not like me because they're not made in the image of God. And that means that there's two things about me that are really important in my self-understanding 600 years ago. First, I'm directly related to God. I'm made in the image of God. So I can't think about me without thinking about God. Those two things go right together. Okay. The second thing is, and this is a little bit derivative from that, and it comes from the history of Jewish and then Christian thought, is we've got to ask, what is it made to be made in the image of God? Right? The same God who made humans in God's image says you cannot make a graven image of me. So clearly it's not my physical form. God doesn't look like me, doesn't look like a man. God doesn't look like a woman. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? And the Christian answer to this was twofold. One, we're rational. We humans are rational. We possess intelligence. And that's different from the beasts, the beasts of the field in this 600 years ago view. They're not intelligent. They're not rational like humans are. The second thing that's about me that's critically important that makes me in the image of God is that I have free will and moral responsibility. Okay, animals aren't responsible for what they do morally. If a lion kills a human being, nobody says he's a sinner. The lion's a sinner. That's just what lions do. They eat stuff, right? But if a human kills a human, that's a moral problem because I have free will and I have moral responsibility. That's what means to be made in the image of God. And I think a lot of us think today the same way. To be human is to be able to relate to the transcendent God who created us, to be rational, and to possess moral responsibility. But I want to point out that beginning about 500 years ago, this changes a little bit. There's something we call pre-modernity, the beginning of the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and some new ideas about what it means to be human are developing. And one of these, people don't think about this a lot, but I'm going to mention a few thinkers, and one is René Descartes, okay? And René Descartes is a thinker who's very concerned about the freedom of the mind, but he's also wondering, what does it mean to be human? And he proposes something. Descartes proposes that a human is a biological machine. That is to say that yeah, we're biological. We know that we've got blood and flesh and all of these things. But Descartes says maybe a way to think about our human bodies is that they're kind of like a machine. They have parts and they have systems, and these parts and systems interact to do things. And of course, Descartes is really at the very proto beginnings of what will eventually become the Industrial Revolution. So he's in a time in which machines are beginning to be very much a part of people's daily lives. He says we're a biological machine. We're systems. We are a system made up of parts and processes that interact with each other. Now, that's going to be transformative for medicine, by the way. To think of humans as biological machines means that you think about all kinds of new ways in which you can heal them and cure them and deal with them. And really, we have the beginnings then of modern medicine. Another thing that's happening is, and Descartes is part of this, John Locke, John Hobbes, these are political thinkers of early modernity. And they have a key concern, and their concern is, how can the human mind break free and become fully rational and fully logical and independent? How can it be freed from superstition? How can it be freed from propaganda? How can it be freed from emotionalism? And why does it need to be freed from emotionalism and propaganda? So that individuals can make free political choices, right? Only people who are intellectually free can create free societies based on rational political structures. And if you want to see that kind of thinking in action, just read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, which are built on this idea. How do you preserve the freedoms necessary for free people to develop rational political systems in which they act freely. But note that something's happening here. And what's happening is the assumption that a lot of what goes on in human beings is not useful to being truly human. That the real depth of the human mind is its logic and its rationality. Emotions are a problem. Superstition's a problem. Irrationality's a problem. So there's beginning to be the idea in the thinking of people in the West, in particular, in Europe, England, and of course the Americas, there's beginning to be the idea that to be human is really to be logical and rational, and to cast off irrationality like religion, for example, or political propaganda. So there's a change happening in the understanding of what it means to be a human. Then a third thing that begins to happen, we're talking the 19th century, is the advent of the concept of evolution, and with Charles Darwin. And one way to look at evolution is that it explains the logic behind the development of biological machines that populate nature. So if humans are biological machines, then of course deer and rabbits and animals and flies and all of these are biological machines, right? They're just much simpler machines than we are. And what evolution does is it explains the relationship between all these biological machines. Now, this word biological machine, I hope you don't find that too off-putting, but I'm going to tell you that if you drive into Houston, Texas today, well, maybe not today because I think the signs come down, but one of the major hospitals in Houston had a large billboard that said, "Proud to serve the world's most complex machine." Right? It's right there. What is the human body that's served by the hospital? It's the world's most complex machine. Okay. What evolution does is it breaks down the hierarchical picture of humanity in relationship to other creatures that's found in the Bible, and instead focuses on the interconnections of creatures all the way from lichens to humans. And that's true especially once DNA is discovered. And what do we discover? We discover that the DNA in our human bodies is 99% the same as that in a fruit fly. Right? We got the same DNA. We're very much connected. So that old biblical hierarchy of each day of creation, the beasts of the field and the plants and the fish and all of this until you get to humans, now becomes a very fluid kind of ramp, let's say, where we're really very closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos. We're a little bit less related to deer and stuff like that. We don't seem very related to fruit flies. But by the way, at the level of DNA, we're related to lichens and fungus. So that old biblical view that puts all those things in hierarchy and us at the top of that hierarchy made in the image of God begins to break down. And so how we understand ourselves is much more on a continuum with other creatures, and yet also much more separated by our logic, the logic of our brains, the rationality of our brains. Okay. Now, a couple other things here. One is, and this happened in my lifetime, and in your lifetimes maybe, certainly in my lifetime, we realized that the universe we live in is unimaginably big and unimaginably old. It's only in the 20th century that we realize that something called the Milky Way is the galaxy we live in, but that some of the things that look like stars in the night sky are whole galaxies of millions and millions of stars. Wow. So where's God? Beyond all of that, we live in a universe. And by the way, we discover through the Doppler redshifts and stuff like this in the 20th century, we discovered that our universe is roughly 13 billion years old. It's infinitely large. and it's still growing. So if part of what it means to be human is not only my relationship to other creatures and stuff and living in the world, but is how I relate to the bigger universe I'm in and the sense of the universe I'm in, well, it turns out that the material world, the physical universe, has now taken up all the space that humans can imagine. There's no beyond it for God to live in. So when we say God is transcendent, what does that mean? Wherever God dwells, it is not physically beyond our material world in the modern concept. That would be considered naive. So you can see how we're changing the image of ourselves in relation to our creatures and our world begins to change, but the image of ourselves within the universe, we become unimaginably small, unimaginably small in a vast universe in which our little Earth is one of billions or trillions of worlds. Our star, the sun, is one of trillions of stars. Even our galaxy, all the stars that we can see normally, is one of trillions of galaxies. Now, let's go a little further with this because you can see how my picture of who I am is changing. In the 20th century, we begin to see also the possibilities expanding for life. One thing that develops in the 20th century is the search for extraterrestrials. Once we realize that there are uncounted numbers of stars, then it would only make sense that there are uncounted numbers of planets. And if there's uncounted numbers of planets out there, even if only 1/1 trillionth of them has life on it, that's still lots. There's almost got to be life out there that we have to know is there so that we're not unique. Our planet's not unique. Our human life form cannot possibly. We are not alone in the universe as the possessors of intelligence and rationality and moral responsibility. And just think, really in the last 120 years or so, 130 years, however you want to count it, but particularly with the advent of really good movies, how our mental world, our imaginative world is populated with aliens, right? Star Wars. All of a sudden, I mean, we go back to Mars, right? The original stuff about the Mars invasion from the 1930s radio shows. But we get up to Star Wars, where now we have these visual images in which we as humans live in a not only a multi-ethnic universe, a multi-special universe. There are many kinds of aliens that have human-like intelligence, and that becomes part of our mental furniture. By the way, along with this, if we're thinking about Star Wars for a second, what's the other feature of Star Wars that's fascinating, that gets right to this business with AI? It's the droids. The droids. There's a seminal moment in the very first of the Star Wars movies, that's episode 4, by the way, in which C-3PO has been dismantled. And at great risk, at the risk of life, at the risk of human life, the android is rescued and reassembled and comes back to life. Luke Skywalker has a relationship with R2-D2. So what's going on here? We're treating an android as if it's of equal value to a human life. We're treating C-3PO and R2-D2 and other androids as if they are our equals, right? As if they're familiars. So what's happening here in the popular imagination of the people who are watching the Star Wars series, we're beginning to think of ourselves in a world populated by artificial intelligences in the form of robots. That's becoming part of our mental furniture. There are stories like this earlier, I, Robot by Isaac Asimov, later made into a movie, right? You see the same thing eventually in the Star Trek series as they move along. By the way, and the Star Trek series will ultimately deal with all kinds of issues about artificial intelligence and is data to be afforded the same rights as a human, right? There's a whole set of episodes on whether data's a human enough to have human rights. That's becoming part of our mental furniture. Now, there's a few other things that are happening I want us to just think about here. Nuclear weapons are developed. We develop space travel, which means we begin to go beyond our planet, first to other planets, and then to the edges of our solar system. And then at a certain place, and this only happened a few years ago, it made my spine tingle. Voyager 1 leaves our solar system and goes into actually outer space. We humans have reached beyond the limits of our world and even the solar system which it's a part. And by the way, Voyager 1 had a message for other forms of life, right? How confidently are we that we're going to find other forms of life? Scientists went to a lot of trouble and expense to send other forms of life a message with Voyager 1. So we've developed nuclear weapons so we can destroy ourselves. We've gone to space travel, which means we can reach beyond ourselves. And now more recently, we have discovered that we're responsible for climate change. And this gives a new name to the era we live in. And you've probably heard it's really relatively recently coined that we live in the Anthropocene. We live in the age of humans in which we are radically self-responsible because we can destroy ourselves. And we can not only destroy ourselves, we can destroy our entire planet. We can destroy all life. There's a great place in Carl Sagan's Cosmos. This is 35 years ago, more than that, 45 years ago. There's a great line in which he says, if we do not destroy ourselves, we will someday venture to the stars. The two things together are important for our sense of what it means to be human. We will venture to the stars if we do not destroy ourselves. That understanding of being human, unimaginable 300 years ago or 400 years ago, where we lived in a small universe that consisted of the Earth in the center, the stars not all that far away, and God outside the stars. Okay. Now, a few other things here. I mentioned that we're biological machines, according to Descartes. We're living that out now through medical technology, computers, material science. A few things are happening. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. One of the things that you cannot see by looking at me is that I have an artificial heart valve that's pumping away or it's working away and keeping me alive. I also have a little device implanted under my skin. It's not a pacemaker, but it tells the doctor if my heart is functioning properly. And I'm hoping that in relationship to the nanoparticles in the COVID vaccine is giving me better selections on Amazon, or at least is letting the deep state track me better. But look, a mere artificial heart valve isn't much, is it? We have cochlear implants. We have people who are walking around on 2 titanium knees, artificial hips, artificial shoulders, right? This idea of being partially, the $1 million man who's sort of part machine and part robot, kind of. That's not science fiction today. Artificial limbs, functional artificial hands. I have a friend who's a specialist in this stuff. That's part of just almost daily life. And when it becomes connected to really intelligent AIs, computers, and all sorts of new materials, then we begin to look more and more like biological machines, don't we? Because we can take out one part and replace it with another part. We already do that. Heart transplants, liver transplants, lung transplants, kidney transplants. Okay. And by the way, do those have to be human? They don't have to be. Humans who are brain dead have been kept alive for more than 2 months with implanted pig's kidneys. Recently, a pig liver kept a brain dead body alive for more than a week. The brain dead body did not die because of the pig liver failure. It died because it was taken off life support because the experiment ended. And then, of course, you all read how last year a man stayed alive for more than 6 weeks with a pig's heart. Replacement parts. We're parts. We're systems. How does that affect our understanding of ourselves? And more importantly, well, look, we're creating alternative forms of life right now by biological manipulation of DNA, cloning, this sort of things. And we've already met these things in fiction. You know, Frankenstein, of course, that's a very old story about this possibility that maybe you could sew parts of dead cadavers together and bring them back to life with electricity. But if you want a more recent reference, Edward Scissorhands. All of these are foreshadowing these possibilities, and all of these kinds of chimeras, these collections of human parts, biological parts, and mechanical parts are everywhere in our fiction. So they're everywhere in our imagined universe. And that leads us to some questions that are critical to this thing of AI. And the first of these questions is this, and then I'm going to pause and see if anybody wants to ask me some questions, but I'm going to ask you some questions. First of all, where is myself? Within this body that I possess, where is Robert Hunt living? Is Robert Hunt diffused through the entire body? Well, that would be a strange thing to say, because if I lose my right arm, I'm still Robert Hunt, right? If I lose my left arm, I'm still Robert Hunt. If I lose one of the valves of my heart and get a cow valve put in, still Robert Hunt. Actually, if my whole heart is replaced by another human's heart, which happens all the time now, I don't become that other human, I'm still Robert Hunt. I lose my foot, I lose my leg, I replace my hips, I replace my knees, still Robert Hunt. Where is Robert Hunt living in this body? That's a good question, but I'll give you a hint. More and more, we locate ourselves in our brains. And that's the medical definition of where your self lives. If you're brain dead, you're dead, right? If there's no more electrical signaling that indicates consciousness, you're dead. So we've already said, where does me lie? Me is in here. Robert Hunt's in here. Cut me off at the neck, keep it all alive. Robert Hunt is still here. There's still a Robert Hunt without anything down. I know that sounds like it's a very strange thing, but I want you to, we need to move to the edges of what our technology is doing so we can understand the seriousness of the questions. If you're not aware of this, okay, Yale University, Yale Medical School, or medical school at Yale, has now been doing for several years an experiment in which they go to an abattoir and they get a pig's head, the head of a pig that's been cut off the body. It's put in ice, it's transported, it's reconnected to all of its veins and stuff are reconnected so that artificial blood, not real blood, artificial blood can be pumped through the pig brain, okay? And then they can check for electrical activity. Now, neuronal activity in the brain is suppressed by strong anesthetics, right? Because it would be inhuman for the pig brain to come alive. But here's what they do know, that after 4 hours, 99% of the cells in the brain are still alive and can be kept alive with artificial blood. So there is a real possibility. We didn't know how long the brain could survive without oxygen cut off, right? 4 hours is the answer for a pig brain. So there's actually a real possibility that just like it used to be, if your heart stopped, you were dead, right? And then we developed a defibrillator. You could shock your heart back into action. It is within the realm of possibility, and it will certainly happen in the near future, that we'll develop an electric defibrillator for the brain, that a brain that appears to be brain dead will be shocked back into activity. I mean, I want you to imagine the moral challenges related to that. Okay. But we're certain to do it because it's such a compelling thing. How could we not do it? right? So that's question one. Where does the self reside? And then second question is, what makes the, and I think a couple of you are anticipating it as I look at the Q&A, what makes my human self different from the self of other animals, right? What sets me apart from them in such a way, for example, that I can eat them, but I can't eat my wife? Okay, that's a very crude way to put it, but you know what I'm saying. Cannibalism's terrible, but eating meat is not. Why? What's the difference between a human self and a cow self that justifies eating meat? Okay. Now, I'm going to come to that now, but let me take up, at least look at the questions here for a second. So one question Steve asks is, where is consciousness? Is it between the synapses of the brain? Is that the soul? And that's a super good question, and I'm going to put you off on it because it's the question that we have to take up next week when we look more at AI. But it is the big question of the day, and I have to say that one of the problems of all discussions of consciousness, and there's a scientific American, there's plenty of books on this. One of the big questions of consciousness is we can't define it right now. It's very hard to define. But we'll have to take up some of the theories of consciousness next week, and we'll see how this is the case. But there's a recent article in Scientific American pointed out that there are two active theories of consciousness, and among neuroscientists, right, and philosophers. And in the last year and a half, it became that 20 years passed from the time that two proponents of these two different theories of consciousness placed a bet that within 20 years, when they met for a conference, they would have an answer to that question. And the guy that bet that they would have an answer in 20 years paid off the other one because they both agreed there was no answer. Nobody knows what consciousness is in a firm way from a scientific standpoint. And I'm not sure you're going to get a greatly different answer from a theological or philosophical standpoint either. Okay. And then can you comment on the idea of a soul? Wow, that's such a good question too, because it's so closely tied with consciousness. What does it mean to possess a soul? In Greek, psyche, P-S-Y-C-H-E, psyche. So that's the root word of psychologist, psychiatry, etc. It's the Greek word that's translated soul in English. And what is it? Where is it? How do I locate this? It's hard to locate myself. How do I locate my soul? I feel like I know I've got one. We humans have always had an instinct that there's something that endures beyond the body. But when we think in a sort of a modern mode, it's hard to identify where it exists. And let me just give you an example of that. Obviously, when I had a heart valve replaced, that was major open heart surgery. So I was on a heart-lung machine for a small period of time while they messed around inside me and split my chest open, all of that stuff. But for a substantive period of time, an hour, maybe an hour and a half, my brain was turned off. My heart was turned off and my brain was turned off. So was I alive while they did the surgery? That's a good question. My brain was turned off and my heart was turned off. And if I was alive, brain turned off, heart turned off, did I have a soul? Did my soul leave the body? Did it go somewhere else? There's all kinds of reports of people who think their soul, they sort of see their body from above and this sort of thing. So super good questions, Jeff and Charlotte and Steve. But if you'll let me, we'll come back to them. But you're totally on the right track with the questions we have to ask. Okay. And I'm supposed to, yeah, my mouse has quit working. Come on, mouse. Come back. Here we go. There we go. Okay. And I've answered those questions live, I think, and therefore I can click done. Okay. So now let's talk about intelligence. We're going to sidestep soul and consciousness for a minute and talk about intelligence. I said that traditionally what it meant to say that we're intelligent is that we're rational creatures. And really what that meant in both in the ancient world and even in the early modern world was that we could create abstractions about the real world problems and operate on the abstractions according to the rule of logic. So that the key sort of ways in which humans demonstrated that they were rational was they did math. We worked on theology and philosophy. In other words, we really worked in the abstract realm, and that was the epitome of being intelligent and rational, was that you could create, in a sense, abstract ideas and operate on these abstract ideas. So it's not really fully intelligent to take two apples and two more apples and then count them and say that's four apples. That's very concrete. Okay. What's really intelligent is to take two abstract symbols, one that looks like a number two and another one looks like a number two, and say, put a plus between them. Now it's all abstract, and say it equals four. What it there equals four? The number of lines in the symbols. The symbols could be in any different language. There's many different ways to write out numbers. It's a completely abstract problem. That's the kind of thing that was taken as the epitome of being rational and intelligent. Mere problem solving was just cleverness, right? If you could solve problems, that was clever. If you could do abstract, complicated abstract problems, that was intelligent. Okay. But this has begun to change in our world, and we need to think about the way it changes. Interesting book. There's too many books for me to mention all the interesting books, but one is entitled "If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal," and it's all about what it means to be intelligent. And it's a fun book to read if you want. If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal. Our contemporary definitions of intelligence have tended to change to mean that we ascribe intelligence to anything that is aware of its environment and can take the actions that allow it to survive and thrive in that environment. Okay, that would be the definition that we use now of intelligence. And that means that just as there's a whole sort of continuum of human life from very simple to very complex, there's a continuum of intelligence. All creatures in contemporary understandings of intelligence have some measure of intelligence. Put another way, the kind of things that 200 years ago we would have ascribed as humans to instinct or cleverness have now begun to be defined as intelligence. Okay. And by the way, one of the things that really has put this over the edge is the recognition that, and this is going to get to something we'll talk about more next week, is the recognition that animals have language, that animals communicate. We don't know their language well, but we're beginning to get a grip on the fact that animals communicate with each other at least some kinds of information. There's danger, there's an enemy near, I'm here, I'm a member of your family, depending on the animal and the sophistication of this kind of sounds they can make. No animal is capable of creating the range of sounds that a human can create, and we don't have any indication that any animal has a language that has the characteristics of human language. But nonetheless, we now ascribe to almost all animals some measure of intelligence. So intelligence doesn't set apart. Okay. Okay. There's another question that's come up, and I'm anonymous attendee. I'm going to get to your question for sure. Okay. So the big question then becomes, what sets humans apart? If the contemporary definition of intelligence is that it's on a continuum, then what is generally agreed is that what sets humans apart is we possess something called general intelligence. We can not only solve real world adaptive problems, we can solve imaginary problems. So we can solve problems that aren't just related to the special problem of surviving and thriving and breeding and eating, but we can potentially solve almost any problem that comes our way. How old is the universe? What's the distance from this star to another star? Those aren't problems that have anything to do with our human survival. By the way, we humans spend the vast amount of our problem-solving ability on these general problems that don't have anything to do with survival. We write poetry, we create music. All of these things seem to be an overflow of any sort of adaptive intelligence. So that's one thing we could say that sets humans apart, is we have general intelligence. Okay. Another thing that goes along with this is the recognition that we have general physical capabilities. We humans are not the best at anything, but we can do a far wider variety of things than any other animal. And that's what's allowed us to live anywhere on the earth, okay, and to dominate all of the other species. I read an interesting article. You can contemplate this if you're a cat lover. Is that the genus of cats is actually one of the most specialized of all the animals. Cats are all the same, right? Dogs have a million different body shapes. The thing about cats, whether it's a house cat or a lion or a tiger, they're all about the same. They act the same, they do the same. So they've somehow taken all the very specialized features of being a cat, and they've managed to adapt themselves by body size to almost any place on earth. They're all carnivores, by the way. All cats are carnivores. They've never evolved to eat anything. So they're a super specialized species, but that's managed to thrive in many different places. Unlike humans, who are really very unspecialized, but can adapt to anything. So I want you to notice something, which my two definitions of what makes a human special, that we have general intelligence and we have kind of a general embodiness, are really abstract. They're not tied to the actual shape of our body or the actual shape of our intelligence. And what that means is that we can begin to imagine a general intelligence that isn't human. We can imagine a general purpose body that isn't human. In short, once we understand that what makes us special is that we have this general intelligence and we have this generalized multiform body, is that we can begin to imagine a robot that can do everything we can do, even if it's not biological. We can imagine aliens from another planet that have a completely different form and composition to us, but also possess general intelligence and general physical capabilities. And finally, we can readily imagine some kind of creature or machine that is superior to us in both intelligence and form, which can be frightening, right? What do you do if you meet something that's of superior intelligence to you? That's a good question. So I think this is kind of where we're going on this. Okay. Oh, another good question. I'm going to come to it, Allison. Yeah, but we begin to imagine ourselves in this way, and that means we can begin to imagine ourselves in a world that has robots in it, a world that has aliens in it, and that means that we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be human in these kinds of imaginary worlds? And by the way, our popular culture is full of imaginary worlds, isn't it? The whole Star Wars series, the whole Star Trek series, and those aren't even the beginning of the different kinds of science fiction that are available to us, not only in movies and videos and television shows, but also, of course, in regular science fiction. Okay, so now let's turn quickly to the historical development of AI. Okay, and I am going to do this fairly quickly because I know that you all are not as interested as I am as in the history of computers. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. 19th and early 20th centuries, a combination of technological and intellectual advances made it possible to create sophisticated mechanical calculators and then sophisticated electrical calculators or electronic calculators. A couple of other things happened that are important, and you'll forgive me for skating over these a bit. One is that in the 20th century, a scholar and then more scholars realized that you could use a binary system of mathematics, that is to say, all ones and zeros, and that you could create and operate. You could create and operate in all logical mathematical operations on a binary system of ones and zeros. In other words, you could characterize every number as ones or zeros, and you could perform every mathematical operation on those ones and zeros. And that meant that you could create a series of circuits built on on-off switches of single choices, right, left, on, off, up, down, that placed in the proper order would perform all logical mathematical operations. Okay. I know that sounds very abstract, but you can buy a game, which I bought for my granddaughters, called the Turing Tumble. And using the Turing Tumble, you can create a mechanical digital computer with all the logical capabilities of any electronic computer. The problem with it is, of course, that electronic computers use parts that are nano-sized, so you get billions of them on a chip. And a mechanical computer, by definition, is bigger. So um, a mechanical computer the size of a good-sized table is the equivalent of basically a computer chip from, well, from long before. Okay. Um, but yeah, you can do it. And it's a fun thing to experiment with. Say, I'm going to make my own computer out of little mechanical parts. Um, Now, the next thing that was necessary was a way to make these new calculators programmable so that they could run a series of logical operations that move one from numbers put in to a solution of a problem put out. And all of this developed in the early and the middle part of the 20th century. So by the 1930s, you had programmable computers that could perform pretty complicated logical operations. And but by the way, they had big tubes, they took up whole rooms, they needed air conditioning, they generated so much heat, and they needed lots of humans putting stuff in and helping them take it out. But what's really important here is that a mathematician named Alan Turing steps in, and what he shows is in mathematical theory that a digital computer, a zero and one computer that performed a set of simple, and there's 5 logical operations, that with these 5 logical operations could do any kind of math that any human could do, working on ones and zeros. And therefore, once you could create the hardware, you could solve any rational problem. But there was something else in Turing that's often forgotten, which is that Turing went a step further and said, properly programmed, then the machine could imitate a human to the point that a human couldn't tell it was talking to a machine. At which case, Turing said, the machine would now be intelligent because it would not be distinguishable from a human. But notice the slip in here. He's defined being human in terms of the capacity for carrying out logical operations in order, right? He's redefined being human, in the brain in particular, the mind in particular, as a logical computer. He said that a computer can imitate a mind, but that's because he made an unspoken move first, which is that the mind is a computer. Okay. That the essence of the working mind is a computer that solves logical problems. Now, that assumption became part of an important movement in the 40s and 50s involving computer scientists, neuroscientists, people who studied the brain, and philosophers who began to talk about cybernetics, which was basically the idea that you would create artificial human minds. And this was greatly moved forward theoretically by what was called information theory, because information theory said that all transfers of information, which is to say all language, okay, including human languages, including the logical languages of computers, indeed all transactions within the natural world, could be characterized mathematically. All information, all transactions that involved information, and information was simply a state of entropy that was lower than chaos, could be characterized mathematically and thus logically. In other words, there would be no difference in the information transfer effected through a loving smile or an angry gesture and the information transfer created by sending a set of answers to a mathematical problem through a computer. And then really you've got a theory, a mathematical theory that says no aspect of human communication cannot be computed. According to the theory, at least, if what we consist of is information that moves back and forth and around, and that was the theory, then it can be reiterated in a computer. It can be computed. Okay. But the takeaway for us at this stage is the working assumption among this relatively small group of scientists and philosophers and neuroscientists that human minds are basically computers and properly understood Computers could therefore mimic the human mind. And then the goal becomes what? Artificial intelligence, but not merely artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, the intelligence that a human mind possesses, not just solving problems. Okay. Now I'm going to pause here. We're in about an hour, and I think it might be good to take up some of your questions at least before I introduce a little bit about where we're going to go next week. So let me do that, and I'm making up notes for myself that we're going to pick this up in week 2. Okay, so let me read a couple of your questions, and I'll ask other people that want to jump in to jump in. One is, I'm optimistic that AI, being so high profile, may help humans be more likely to assess the rational critical mind and less likely to buy into propaganda, conspiracies, theories, and etc. What do you think about that? Right now, the problem with this, your optimism on this, is that AI is particularly good at generating very realistic propaganda and extremely believable conspiracy theories. This is one reason there's so much talk about regulating AI and its output. But already I can tell you that with the tools that I possess, which cost almost nothing per month to subscribe to, I could create a 5-minute video of Barack Obama endorsing Donald Trump. And you would not be able to tell from the voice or the picture or the movements that it wasn't real without looking very carefully. That kind of thing is now low-hanging fruit. To create a picture that appears to show a group of rioters assassinating a presidential candidate, that's low-hanging fruit right now. There are tells, there are ways that can be done. But one of the biggest questions we're going to have is, how do we know the truth? And do churches support the idea that we should think about the truth? But yeah, I'm afraid that at the moment, the capacities of AI could be used for harm to a great extent. Now, the flip side of that is you're right about the optimism in this sense, that if you've got ChatGPT on your computer and you're talking to it, then you can find out a bunch of stuff. You can look and find out the truth. If you're not always being fed the truth, then you can go check and find the truth in the same way that you could hopefully do a Google search. But in some way, we humans are going to have to use our rational minds and our abilities to talk to one another, confirm things, and use common sense. If we're going to get through this, and AI can either be a part of the problem or it can be a part of the solution in that sense. Allison says, I wonder what part of us makes us human. If part of what makes us human is our need to be unique from everything else. Oh, can you please comment? I love the comment. I think that's a great comment. That the problem is we can't test it against animals because we can't talk to them well enough yet. But yeah, maybe our humanity is what makes us desire to not be deer, etc. I suspect that's a pretty Western worldview, because we find in Chinese Taoist philosophy in particular a great sense that you don't realize your full humanity until you realize your oneness with all aspects of nature. But I think that's a super question. Is math the language of God? Wow, such a good question too. And the reason I say it's such a good question is, let's talk about a couple of big problems that don't have directly to do with AI, but have everything to do with cosmology and physics, which is what I read in my spare time instead of Christianity Today. That's why they don't trust me to teach Christianity. There are two big problems in cosmology today. And one of them is what's called the anthropic principle. Why is it that in the complex and supposedly undirected evolution of the entire universe, somewhere on a tiny planet around a mediocre star among the trillions of galaxies, planets, there arises a creature who happens to be capable of understanding the whole universe? I mean, sometimes it's called the fine tuning problem. How is it that with uncountable opportunities for things to go wrong, the universe comes up to be the universe where we can exist? Now, this may sound strange, but we know from cosmological models of the development of the universe that if a variance of 1/1,000,000th of 1% in a number called the cosmological constant had occurred, there would be no life anywhere in the universe, much less on Earth. How, you know, how is it that the one universe happens to be perfectly tuned for us? Good question. One of the answers to this is what's called the multiverse, which is the idea, well, we just happen to live in the one universe that's equipped for us. That's not really a question, right? We wouldn't know otherwise. So there must be millions or zillions or quadrillions of other universes. The problem with the whole multiverse theory is that it's not a scientific theory because it can't be proven. It's a speculation that allows us to do away with the question of why this universe is so suitable for us. So if we could have another whole series of things on the cosmological, on the anthropic principle. But closely related to the anthropic principle, and this is the question that physicists like Steve Weinberg ask, is why does math work so well to characterize the universe? Why isn't this abstract set of logical operations on numbers, which by the way get more complex and sophisticated and stuff, why does it work so well? Why should it be that something as abstract as calculus turns out to be exactly the right tool for talking about stock markets? Why does an abstract, by the way, a lot of the knowledge we have of the modern universe, cosmology, quantum science, all this stuff, a lot of it depends on mathematical theories that were developed before there were any experiments that indicated they were necessary. There were mathematicians playing games with numbers. And then a physicist who's trying to figure out how to characterize his experimental results in 1930 goes back and says that a young French mathematician who died at age 23 happens to have developed exactly the mathematical theory that I can now plug my numbers into and get the right results. So it's a mystery. Why should math work so well to describe the natural world? What obliged the natural world to be mathematical in nature? Super good question. Is it the language of God? Well, that's like the anthropic question, right? Remember that philosophers, not even Christian philosophers, even non-Christian philosophers, believed that what we shared with God was rationality. But that's what it means to be made in the image of God. We're rational like God. And to that question, then, is math the language of God, Steve? The answer would be yes. And that's why we can do it. Because God does math. God speaks the language of math, and God created us to speak that language too. Who or what do you think should determine how far we take AI from a technological perspective? Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Seems there's a lack of thoughtfulness about this as we race ahead. Okay. I'm not sure about a lack of thoughtfulness, but in part, that'll be easier to answer next week. In part, I would say that the general AI world is divided into the Sam Altmans, let's go as fast as we can. These problems will solve themselves. And the recent board of OpenAI that he managed to get rid of, they said, whoa, 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 we need to slow down. Okay. And the bigger question with this is, do you regulate the output of AI, or do you regulate the research that leads it forward? And these are complicated legal and moral problems. To some extent, the GPT LLM transformers, I haven't talked about that, but I will, are self-regulated now because they don't want to generate the kind of offensive content that would draw legal regulation. So you cannot get ChatGPT to draw a naked body or to draw a work of bloody violence. Okay. That's not built into the artificial intelligence aspect. Those are guardrails that are put onto the outputs. But obviously you could create a GPT LLM transformer that had no guardrails and that created all kinds of stuff that was pornographic, nasty, vicious, etc. And so who, but do you stop the research, or do you regulate the output? That's a good question. And who's going to make those decisions? Those are properly governmental decisions. Do we trust business? Do we trust government? Well, it could depend on who you think is more trustworthy. That's and lack of thoughtfulness. Actually, I would say there's a lot of people that are very thoughtful about this on many levels, but almost none of them live in Austin or Washington, D.C. The United States is the only developing nation that has not had ever some kind of governmental level body asking what are the effects of the economy of artificial intelligence. Because the possible effects of the economy of artificial intelligence and unemployment were well known 6 years ago, before we ever saw ChatGPT. The SMU, my university, had a conference on this 6 years ago, in which the CEO of IBM, guys from the Stanford Business School, discussed the potential effects on employment of AI and said it will be like nothing that we have ever experienced before. We ought to be talking about it. Well, we had our conference and wrapped it up, and nobody kept talking about it. But people do talk about it. They just don't talk about it in Washington, and that's the problem. They do in Berlin. They do in Vienna. They do in London. They do in Paris. They do in Manila, in the Philippines. The Philippines government has had a group working on this for more than 10 years. Of course, they're talking about it in China and Thailand and India. We're not talking about it here. That's the problem. We're not talking about it in the U.S. Okay. There are plenty of thoughtful people. We're not living among them, unfortunately. But by the way, there's a guy named Lex Friedman. He's got a podcast. If you don't mind listening to long podcasts, and he's got a funny accent that drives me nuts, but still, you can listen to Lex Friedman's podcast on AI, and you'll hear some intelligent discussions about this, along with some of the stuff in the New York Times podcasts. Yeah, people are talking about it. They're just not talking about it in DC. For those of us lean more toward emotional intelligence, where does this new movement, this AI movement, leave us? Well, this is Susan asked that question. I think that's a really good question, and here's why. Because a lot of the work in AI is done by people who are super intelligent, but emotional intelligence is not like top of their list. Probably the greatest expenditure of effort in applying ChatGPT to so-called real-world problems by computer programmers who are deep into this system is creating artificial girlfriends. Now, the fact that this is what they obsess over is creating an AI girlfriend kind of tells you where their big problem is in human relationships. The reality is AIs are very far from having any kind of emotional intelligence. And although they're quite good at dealing with words, but not facial expressions, much less, they're going to try to do it. They're doing it. They're working on it. I guarantee they're working on it. But even then, and maybe put it this way, because this will be a good way to come into it. One of the things I mentioned that at the beginning of cybernetics, the idea was that these scientists and neuroscientists said, look, we're beginning to see what a brain looks like, right? With the advances in microscopy in the 20th century, they begin to be able to see how a brain is structured, how these, down at the neuronal level and the level of synapses, how a brain is put together. and they begin to have the tools to explore how the brain works electronically. Still very crude, right? But they're beginning to think they get it. And so the more they try to understand a brain, not just a human brain, it could be the brain of a flatworm or some simple brain, right? Um, the more they understood the way the brain was structured, the more they would imagine we'll create a human brain, right? How do you create human level general intelligence? You create a human brain. Okay. Now, let's fast forward from the 50s and 60s and go to, say, the Santa Fe Institute, which works on artificial intelligence all the time at a philosophical level. And one of the things that is now quite widely recognized is that whatever artificial intelligence is being created, and we'll understand this better when I move a little forward, whatever artificial intelligence is being created, it's not human intelligence. Whatever ChatGPT is, it's not human intelligence. It's some other kind of intelligence that speaks really well to humans, right? That seems to understand us and be able to answer our questions really well, but it's not human. The GPT hardware, computer hardware, filling vast warehouses and sucking vast amounts of electricity, is not a model of a human brain. It's something different. What it is, we don't really know. Okay. And one of the questions is then, if it's characteristic of humans that we're not just logical, if it's characteristic of humans that we are, if it's characteristic of humans that we're emotional as well and intuitive, then we really can't know if an AI has emotional intelligence. We know that AIs are trained on us talking, and therefore they imitate us talking very well. But that doesn't mean they actually feel anything. We don't, more about that later, but it's a really good question.
So Dr. Hunt, I had a
Yeah,
quick one. I've been
yeah,
thinking about
fire in
this.
there. Yeah,
Yeah, a little bit. So I mean, it seems like a lot of what you're talking about is at this stage in the game
yeah,
that what most of what we see in the AI world is what we could classify as a narrow intelligence. It's basically a probability engine. We can call it intelligent because it's aware of the environment that it's operating in to a certain degree, and
right.
it's taking action. So I'm thinking of something as simplistic as like the Roomba that sweeps my house, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that could be defined as a narrow intelligence. And
Absolutely.
and so we can say that it's these things, but when we think about it being a human intelligence, that's when we make the jump to saying, okay, now this is a general intelligence. There's
Right.
something else going on here. And when we make that leap, then
Mm-hmm.
that triggers us to think that now there's some sort of moral obligation and relationship between me and this
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Yeah.
There's a way that it's supposed to act towards me and be aware of me, and then I in turn am supposed to be aware of it. And that gets to be about as close to humanity as you can get. And could it be said that that stuff is needed for us to even approach the question of thinking about, is a machine conscious and can it feel? Because I don't know how you can generate emotion without some level of moral obligation.
Right.
But then again, and I want you to comment on this. This is what philosophers call the alignment issue.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that
Exactly.
even if I have a superior intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
I could give that thing a task, and it would be so centered on achieving that task to its ultimate end
Mm-hmm.
that it would abandon all sense of morality as I see it and start doing things that would seem totally irrational to me, but would be completely rational to it
Right.
because it wanted to achieve that end.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
it,
because its interests are not aligned with your interests. That's the word alignment, right?
right.
Then one of the big questions is, how do you align the interests of an AI with human interests when we know that it's not a human intelligence? Okay, that's this is where we talk about the danger that you've talked of. We set it to a task, and it becomes so firmly embedded in that task that it actually destroys the person who asked it to do it.
Right.
Okay. Um, the classic paperclip example. Anyway, we don't need to go into it, but I think this is one. I think this is a question that needs to be asked, and it's an important question. I do think that when we're talking about the well, so let's take it at two levels. One is what I've already mentioned, which is just because it sounds human doesn't mean it is human, right? Um, the the reality is, well, and this is an example that I do not intend in the least to be offensive, but my wife works with people, young people, who are on the autism spectrum. Okay, so young people on the autism spectrum are intelligent, they're feeling, they have a lot of things, but they have a lot of trouble reading other people's emotions and responding to them appropriately. Okay. But that doesn't mean they can't get along in society, but they take a good deal of training. They have to learn um, to 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 simulate, in a sense, a kind of behavior that doesn't come as naturally to them as it comes to us. On the other hand, they don't have to be trained to do Rubik's cubes. So there, by the way, the the AI industry is full of people who have this superhuman levels of concentration and logical problem solving, but a little bit trouble with emotional intelligence. Um, we should and by the way, let's take a group that's not even that. Let's take actors. What do actors do? They learn to pretend to be emotional. I did, you know this, Jerry, but I did a little acting work back in 2013 and 2014 when I acted on the television series Dallas, the new Dallas. And I got to know a lot of actors, and I got to know the directors and the producers. And one of the producers of that television show said, because I said, you know, they're also friendly. They seem to like me, even though I'm not really one of them too much. I'm just around. And he said, they're actors. Don't ever forget they're actors. He said, sometimes they don't know if they're acting friendly or they really like you. Okay. So that's AI can be taught to seem very human. It can develop that in its training. That doesn't mean it is. And that's one of the big questions is it? Does the fact that it appears aligned with our feelings mean that it really is aligned with our feelings? Let's leave that as a question. It's profoundly a question. Because it will appear to be emotionally intelligent, but not. Look, Jerry, one of the things we talked about, and yeah, we're coming down towards the end of our time here. So I'm going to pick up how artificial intelligence develops so we know exactly what it is by the end of next week, if that's okay. But we've really raised a lot of big questions. I just had a student, a doctoral student, graduated from our program. His name is Drew Dixon, Dr. Drew Dixon now. Drew wrote his dissertation on the ethical and pragmatic implications of having a chatbot as a spiritual guide or spiritual director. Okay, so this was a theoretical exploration of those questions. And the dissertation, as you might expect, was dense with information about how AIs actually work and this sort of thing. Now, there's two things to know about this, just to catch us up if we haven't been reading the news. One is that AI chatbots have been used in hospital medical counseling situations for more than 10 years. Always very well received. They're so long enough that there are now studies of how they're used and how they're perceived. The perceptions are generally positive. Why? Because the chatbot is available 24/7. It's non-judgmental. It doesn't betray secrets, right? It gives answers. Even the crude ones gave answers. Okay. So there's already research on how humans relate to chatbots in this respect. Fast forward now. Facebook/Meta has released through Instagram a series of chatbot friends that you can have. One of whose name is Brian, who's the grandfather you never had. Brian happens to be black, so he's the black grandfather I never had. But Brian's the one of their chatbots that will be happy to talk about his religion. He's a non-denominational Pentecostal Christian, and he's happy to talk about faith with you. Okay. Other ones will only talk about makeup. But so that's already in the market. That's already out there. Drew himself has now created and trained and released into the market what he calls the digital shepherd or guide. And he's doing his testing on it now. He's doing surveys of people who asked to use it. I've looked at the preliminary results of about 280 of these surveys. They are about 95% positive. The average person who begins talking about their spiritual problems with the digital shepherd spends more than 25 minutes on it. But here's a key thing. One of his questions is, why do you trust it? You know it's an AI, right? You knew up front. I never lied to you. You knew you were talking to a chatbot. Why do you trust it? And you know what everybody says? We trust it because we know you wrote it. We know you trained it. We know the human behind it. And therefore we can trust it. And in our world, Jerry, Drew is not a big deal. Okay. You probably never heard of him. So I invite you to Google him, because his Encounter podcast has something over 1 million listeners at times, some 280,000 subscribers on a weekly basis. So in a certain part of the evangelical Christian world, Drew Dixon is a name that people know and they trust. And so therefore they trust his chatbot. Okay. So these are complex questions, right? Of the relationship between, is it just the chatbot, or is it the fact that it's a chatbot that I associate with a human whom I trust as a spiritual guide in any case, right? For those who are interested in Christian ministry, you say, well, why did now Dr. Dixon create it? And the reason he created it was because, look, I'm doing a podcast weekly of, actually, there's many hundreds of them now, so he's not creating many new ones, of guided meditation. Well, if 50,000 people in a week listen to your voice in their ears as they meditate, they pretty much think of you as their personal friend. But how do you get to be a pastor to 50,000 people? Right? How do you answer all the emails? And so that's what got Drew into this. Could AI be a way I extend my persona to the members of my church?
And would you say that only works if we limit AI to a narrow intelligence? It can't evolve beyond that for that level of trust to remain.
That's a good question, because at what point does the AI evolve enough that it starts misrepresenting itself? We don't
Right.
know that these. And by the way, to get back, I am going to talk more about this narrow and wide thing next week, I promise, and the basis of it. But I'll leave you with an anecdote. I'm looking in the Q&A to make sure I do try to touch on everyone.
Well, and to answer that one for Susan, I was going to get with Dr. Hunt and get these podcasts and get a list of these things for y'all to pass on. So yes, I will.
Yeah, I'll send you a bunch of links, Jerry, for this stuff.
Okay.
This is going to be anecdotal, but it gets exactly the point. At this moment, OpenAI and Bard and OpenAI, Google, and Meta are all being sued by people who say, look, you trained your AI on our content and we got nothing for it. You didn't ask us. Now, this is going to be in courts for a long time, because I train my students on their work and I don't ask their permission, and my students don't ask their permission before they write an essay on their work, right? Once you put it out there, man, it's there. Okay. So what do we owe the creators? That's one question. But Sam Altman of OpenAI's response, the New York Times has sued OpenAI, saying OpenAI trained its material on vast amounts of New York Times stuff and then it reproduces it, not word for word ever, no copyright violation, but it reproduces it as if it's knowledge that's coming from OpenAI without acknowledging the New York Times. And here's what Sam Altman said. He said, doesn't matter to us. If we have to pull all of the New York Times material out of OpenAI's training, it will train itself and reproduce it. In other words, the OpenAI no longer needs input from outside. It just thinks about what it already knows and generates that knowledge. Okay, that's a little bit scary. Okay, but by the way, it's that we talk about what is human general intelligence. One of the characteristics of humans is we close our eyes and we begin to imagine stuff. We create knowledge without any input. We recombine in new ways stuff that we already know, and something new emerges. So that very statement by Sam Altman then makes us go, okay, we've got some serious questions here. Right. Because he basically said, if I want to know all the news there is to know, I don't need the New York Times. Right. Maybe I just need a Reuters feed. And by the way, OpenAI and Google and those groups, they've already cut a deal with Reuters. They're already paying for that. So they can just, okay, New York Times, we can pay you a little bit and you can drop the lawsuit, or we can just cut you off and it doesn't matter. You see which one you like better. Because at least now, if I say, what does the New York Times think about this? It cites the New York Times. In the future, it would just say, I've never heard of this New York Times thing. Don't bother with them. Okay, a couple of quick questions. Could AI become so intelligent it's able to prove or disprove there's life after death for humans? I'm going to give you an answer that's not an answer, but I love to take us off to where we can think about things. A guy who was a physicist at Oklahoma State University, is that right? No, he's maybe at Oklahoma. Anyway, named Frank Tipler, T-I-P-P-L-E-R, Frank Tipler, wrote a book in the 90s. And the question of the book was are we going to have life after death? And Tipler's thesis was that if the cosmological constant was between two different figures, nobody knew at that time what it was exactly, then it was inevitable that we would have life after death. And the reason he said this was inevitable is because we would create a computer that would recreate us entirely in its own computer consciousness, and therefore we'd be alive forever. But that this would happen, by the way, at the very end of time, when time slows to almost a standstill because of the gravitational forces.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Okay, so that's Frank Tipler. A novel, if you want to read it, that's a fun novel by Neal Stephenson, is called Fall or Dodge in Hell. It's a science fiction novel that explores this very idea. Not that AI is so intelligent it could prove or disprove life after death, but AI that becomes so intelligent that it can create a digital world in which there is eternal life for everybody. And then I want to send you way back to a short story that, Jerry, I think I mentioned it to you in an email, but I'll send you a PDF of the entire story by Isaac Asimov called Nightfall.
Yeah, you did mention that in the email.
Okay. So Nightfall is publicly accessible. It's as a PDF. I can send Jerry the PDF. This is an old story. This is a story from the 1950s. So I want us to I want to remind us this. The questions of artificial intelligence, what artificial intelligence can do, how it might replace or contest humans, are not questions that have just arisen for philosophers, science fiction writers, and authors in our society in the last 5 years. One of the reasons I'm not afraid of AI is because I've spent my whole life thinking about it. It is not a surprise to me in the least. Okay. Nothing about it is a surprise to me. But Nightfall, Isaac Asimov, I'm not going to tell you the story. You just have to imagine it. But it comes to an interesting and theological conclusion about AI and eternal life. If you're interested in more books on this, a wonderful series of 3 science fiction novels, I think partially on Netflix now, by Chu Lin. The one you want to look for is The 3-Body Problem. That's the first of the 3 of these science fiction novels. But it's such a good question. Prove or disprove there's life after death. I'm not sure how you would construct a proof, but of course, one obvious proof would be to create it. And with that, let me tell you what we're going to do next week. We're going to start with talking about how you program AI computers and the modern AI revolution, and then we'll take more questions when we're more fully informed about what AI looks like in its machine form. How's that?
Sounds wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Hunt, for everything, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Friends, as I mentioned in the chat, I'll gather some resources and get this recording done for you, so you should be getting that from me within the next few days. So thank you, Dr. Hunt. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your evening.
Enjoyed it.
All right. Bye.
Bye.